Namaskar. Namaskar. Aalgaard on Yoshimi, Grassroots Fascism, the war experience of the Japanese people. Author Yoshiaki Yoshimi. Reviewer Scott W. Aalgaard. Yoshiaki Yoshimi, Grassroots Fascism, the war experience of the Japanese people. Translated by Ethan Mark, New York, Columbia University Press. Reviewed by Scott W. Aalgaard, the University of Chicago, published on H. Japan, June 2050, commissioned by Simon Nantes. Namaskar. Timing, written Shakespeare famously said is everything. That Ethan Mark's elegant translation of Yoshimi Yoshiaki's Kuga no ne Fascism 1987, rendered in English by the translator as Grassroots Fascism, should be made available in an historical moment marked by the approach of the 17th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War on the one hand, and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's apparent determination to rewrite the history of complexity to the global scholarly discourse on the nature of Japan's war and indeed on the social mechanics of war in general. This richness and complexity stems from the fact that Yoshimi's work chooses to see the war not from the standpoint of geopolitics and military strategy but from the level of everyday actors, the grassroots of the title, seeking to survive the war on terms beneficial to them, both on the home front and in Japan's former colonies. In its examination of the ways in which individuals navigated the circumstances of war and the demands of the state, Yoshimi's work calls to mind such important and pioneering works as Sheldon Caron's Molding Japanese Mind (1997) and Louis Young's Japan's Total Empire (1998), but its scope is considerably more expansive. Yoshimi has scored dozens of finished and official accounts to tell the stories of individuals who are sometimes ecstatic, sometimes despondent, often conflicted, but always driven by the quest for survival, even posthumous survival in some cases, in its most effective moments. In other words, Yoshimi's work can be considered an empirical manifestation of important theoretical insights from the thinkers from Baruch Spinoza to Gilles Deleuze, and makes an excellent comparison to the two other works that grapple with questions of survival in terms of crises such as from, for example, Ken C. Kawashima's The Proletarian Gamble, Korean Workers in Interwar Japan 2009. The book is headed by an excellent translator's introduction wherein Mark helped to familiarize the reader with the historicity of war and fascism, and revealed by Yoshimi in the ensuing chapter, and with some of the dominant analytical approaches to war and fascism as considered on both Japanese and global scale. Indeed, an important ins- insistence of the author here is that Japan and the global are always already inextricably intertwined in a reality that inform both the manner inform both the manner in which Japanese fascism fueled in part by any and imperial societies imperial and imperial and imperial and societies developed, and the way in which the experience of the war and fascism were narrated after the fact. Marx provides a concise overview of the conceptual routes by which Japanese fascism was typically approached by post-war analysts as a consequence of feudal remnants, for example, or as a freakish and tragic misstep on the path to capitalist modernity, or as Maruyama Masao argues, Maruyama Masao argues as a sort of combination there, and situates Yoshimi's contribution amid the historical discourses dominant at the time of work's release, in the midst of an analytical climate that tended to situate the fountainhead of the fascism at an variously envisaged top of society. Mark insists that what ultimately sets Yoshimi's approach apart is his combination of an MP, empyrean combination of an empyrean empire-wide perspective with a focus on the rise of fascism from the bottom up, and crucially, the translators sets the groundwork for a critical understanding of precisely how and why fascism intertwined with the many social actors at the grassroots of this period, by pointing out that fascism's greatest support came from those whose skills equipped them with the social potential and ambitions to enter the middle class, even as, or perhaps precisely because their achieved social and material positions did not as yet match this potential. The body chapters of Yoshimi's work itself are very sometimes brutally engages, engaging, though they tend to lean more towards an empirical exploitation at varying moments of Japan's war than they do towards critical analysis per se. In this, we can all clearly hear Yoshimi's response to the historical moment and attendant analytical culture of its original production, as noted by Mark, but whole innovative. This emphasis on the experiences of the grassroots at expense perhaps of critical clarity offers appears today as something of an ambiguous strategy, one that both enhances and undermines the strength of the book in terms of its value to contemporary scholars. Chapter first, from democracy to fascism, for example, provides both an important overview of some of the structural economic factors that contributed to the rise of fascism, including the exacerbation of unevenness between urban and rural areas and the reluctance on the part of middle to lower social actors to translate this content with the state and socio-economic conditions into the state and socio-economic condition into the cultural resistance to war, owing to the beliefs that the state's misadventures would ultimately improve the condition of their own lives against the backdrop of the lived experiences of diverse sectors in the early war period. Some of these examples, such as that of Akita teacher Kimura, whose war experience fed a desire for social engineering that could truly be considered fantastic, a project that he pursued in earnest on his return from the frontier, extremely illustrative of the relation between war and fascism. Other examples, which, however, we have while clearly brutal examples of anti-Chinese racism and acidic side effects of nationalism, seem less concretely to tether to the development of fascism itself, and as I shall discuss below, it is this ghostly, omnipresent treatment of something called fascism that threatens to frustrate attempts to lay concise critical hold thereof. Chapter 2, Grassroots Fascism, serves to continue the discussion of the ways in which individual sectors navigated Japan's war years and how the choices that they made tied into imperial fascism. At this point in the narrative, imperial fascism speaks to the mechanics, including, for example, the Kyokoku Ichi Taisi, which invoked the dissolution of political parties of a self-imposed oneness, one manipulated by conjuring a gravitational pull of a national body centered upon the emperor, and the manners in which this conceptual oneness served to bolster fascism of particular interest. Here is Yoshimi's attention to the desire of women, who are depicted as having cooperated enthusiastically with the state policy in order to raise their own stations and standards of living, and to movements such as lifestyles of living, and to movements such as the lifestyles of living, and to the movements such as lifestyles reform movement of Okinawa, Okinawa of which aimed at the eradication of dialect and backward customs as means by which to draw nearer to an imagined Japanese culture. Center to Yoshimi's critique here, of course, are the ways in which desires for inclusive and belonging veered their ways through the choices made by grassroots actors, and particularly marginalized grassroots actors in the imperial period. Lurking behind these specific critics, however, lay rather uneasy slippage between patriotism and nationalism and fascism. While the former are clearly problematic in their own right, one is the left wanting of a more surgical excision of the fascistic in in order to lay it bare and potentiate a and potentiate a critic thereof that is not necessarily limited to historical condition of war. The question of precisely where oneness eases to constitute solidarity, for example, and begins to develop into fascism is also of a great importance to this sort of critical exercise. In Chapter 3, The Asian War, Yoshimi shifts his focus to how the war has experienced by Japanese actors for the most part in Asia and introduces some of the ways in which geographic specificity impacted the complex and ambiguous ways in which Japan's war was created and comprehended by actors in the colonies. In an intriguing sort of twist on Maruyama's understanding of imperial fascism, Yoshimi reveals the ways in which Japan's Holy War and its purported missions were purposed purported missions were disparaged as groundless by disgrace. The nearer one was to local residents and their lives in Asia. In other words, the more dismissive Yoshimi's actor appeared to be of any merit to Japan's war. Highlighted in this chapter is Yoshimi's attention to the sometimes unpredictable ways in which the actual lived of war in geographically disparate locales shaped the outlooks of individual Japanese actors. It was not fascism as a universal somehow the Japanese contagion that served to bolster the war, but rather a reciprocal relationship to history that served to bolster fascistic outlooks, but sometimes alternative outlooks as well. Yoshimi introduces us, for example, to an actor named Ida, whose pacifism and later esteem for post-war war renouncing Japanese constitution could be traced to his wartime experiences. It is in fact this reciprocal relationship to the history that seems to hold the conceptual key to history and seems to hold the conceptual key to releasing fascism from its confinement to movements of war. A leap I will suggest below that is of crucial importance to ongoing studies of fascism and social phenomena. Indeed, it was precisely such historically and geographically specific experiences that in Yoshimi's formation finally brought about the undoing of support for Japan's war. As the author points out in the work's final chapter, Democracy from the Battlefield, War, weariness rooted in material shortages and the outright terror of the bombing of the homeland, contributed greatly to the collapse of the Japanese people's will to fight. The concrete historical experience of the impending defeat led, in other words, from a shift in emphasis from the sacrifice for the state to self presentation and as a result confronted with the severely negative side of war, and the people were finally beginning to separate from the fascist state. But as Yoshimi notes with some puzzlements and apparent dismay, this did not intentionally lead to an abandoning of imperial outlook and seizure of the opportunity to free themselves from the conflictive power of the imperial state. It is perhaps precisely in this bafflement over the this mis this decisionment misdi misdi misdigement bafflement over the decisionment disagreement between historical reality and social directionally itself, seemingly rooted in a lurking assumption that war provides both the foundation potentially conditioned for fascism and in its cessation the conditions for its demise, that we can defeat the presence of the analytic premise most demanding of further scholarly attention. As would be expected from its title, fascism, or something called fascism, haunts all corners of this work, permitting the strategies and desires of Yoshimi's actors even as it is bolstered and solidified by the same. But as a wise teacher of mine once said, the if fascism is everything, then it is also nothing. In other words, it is precisely and paradoxically fascism that remains something of a translucent, shape-shifting spectre throughout the book, playing at the corners of our peripheral vision and seeming to vanish as soon as we attempt to bring it into focus. To be sure, Yoshimi's understanding of the nature of an emperor system, fascism, and its dual pronged, pronged, pronged consequence of mobilization and suppression. Here, as Mark points out, Yoshimi shares much with Marxist scholar Furuya Tetsu is distilled effectively in the introduction to the work, but as I have noted above, most of the empirical narrative unearthed and prevented by the author concentrates understandably on individual experience in the war and the various strategies deployed to survive its horrors. This is, of course, highly illuminating, but the strategy seems somehow to render elusive the fulfillment of the work's critical potential and presents unanticipated challenges for understanding these narratives of fascism as opposed to war or nationalism, and for many and many of the many of the experiences revealed by the Yoshimi's are heart breaking and brutal to be sure, but what precisely makes them fascism or ties them to fascism as social phenomena? Fascism as is well by the indicated by the introduction to the book is infuriatingly difficult to define precisely and thus to lay critical grasp of. First by First, by no means wish to suggest that Japan did not experience fascism during the war years of 1931 to 1945. I am convinced that it did, but the danger inherent in equating fascism to nationalism, wartime fascism to nationalism, or to wartime strategies of survival is that we risk reproducing precisely that and the analytical error committed by Edwin O. Chaucer, and other that is the error of committing fascism and the other that is the error of committing fascism to movements in history animated by war. Hello, namaste.
Hello,
Hello.
बउआ
And the and other that is the error of committing fascism to movements in history animated by war, which amounts to a premature erosion of a howl that continues to haunt the world in Japan and beyond. There, there seems, in other words, a pressing needs to disentangle the mechanic, mechani, mechani, mechanics of fascism from the experience of war and the ambiguous potential of nationalism in order to render its it visual before it reveals itself to us on its own terms. This is crucial work that hopefully will be pursued by area studies and history scholars in the years to come. It is my fervent hope that reader will view comments herein not so much as criticism of Yoshimi's very fine work, but rather as modest suggestions concerning how scholar might build upon the important foundation that is it provides. By situating fascism in the realm of everyday, Yoshimi Yoshiaki was far ahead of his time when he released Ushano ne Fushizumu in 1987, situated alongside other pioneering works that aims to shift the emphasis of investigations into the social from state policy and superstructure to the ambiguous ways in which individual actors aim to that aims to shift the emphasis of investigation into the social from state policy and superstructure to the ambiguous ways in which individual actors aim to navigate the condition of their own existence. Yoshimi's extremely important and highly engaging work and Ethan Mark's elegant, insightful, and eminently readable translation thereof is sure to prompt further discussion about the nature of fascism and its relationship to history, paving the way to even more concise and critical engagement with both and if these has been and if there has been any moment in recent history when such a discussion is pressing and timely, surely that moment is now. Citation W. Scott W. Aalgaard, Review of Yoshimi Yoshaki Grassroots Fascism, The War Experience of Japanese People. H. Japan H. Net Reviews, June 2015. Thank you. धन्यवाद.